You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about Dario Argento's 1977 horror classic, Suspiria. Here we go. Shall we get into a little Suspiria action here?
Sure.
Because we're talking about Suspiria 1977 on the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me today, fellow co-host Pete Charbonneau. We have returning guest Megan, and we are talking about one of her picks, 1977 Suspiria, directed by Italian director Dario Argento.
Roses are red, violets are blue. The iris is the flower that will mean the end of it.
Suspiria. You can run from Suspiria. Suspiria. You can hide from Suspiria. You cannot escape Suspiria. The only thing more terrifying than the last 12 minutes of Suspiria are the first 92.
Megan, we've talked about The Thing, we've talked about Pumpkinhead, and now we're talking about arguably, I think, Argento's best known film, and he's got quite a few films in his catalog. If you kind of look back at like the late 70s into the late 80s, he's got a lot of films like Phenomena, Tenebrae, Bird with the Crystal Plumage, Deep Red, known for those like giallos, but this isn't really a giallo, but movies that are kind of made with a lot of like that bright red Technicolor blood, and there's violence and supernatural elements involved. Suspiria, certainly part of that. Why did you throw this one out there to talk about?
So this was a suggestion to me, but as my brother-in-law, he's like, you absolutely have to see this one. This one's fantastic. So I also just saw this one for the first time, went in completely blind, did not have any story for it, didn't know anything at all other than this is where I can watch it, go watch it. So there were so many things to take away from this, but it definitely, for the first part of it sitting there, I was like, this was recommended to me. I'm sure I'll figure out why eventually.
You'll catch up on why it was recommended. First time watch for you, Pete, sticking with the first time watch theme.
First watch, first time, first watch that I ever owned was probably a Swatch watch back in 85. We talked about this before. We've had superstar guest Nick Dyack on, who is one of the connoisseurs of Italian cinema. My breadth of knowledge when it comes to giallo and movies like with Fulci and Argento, very limited. So I'd never seen Suspiria before, so I watched it last night for the first time, and again, glad to have crossed one of those heavy hitters in terms of of the genre off my list now.
This movie, wow. What did you guys think? Initial impressions? Because again, I've said it before, I'll say it one more time. I did not get to like rent a lot of movies or watch movies as a kid. And then once I went to college, I went full bore, watched them A to Z, this being one of them. Same conversation with like Night of the Living Dead, a lot of those franchise sequels. I'd seen some of those as TV edits, but then being able to see the fully unedited version of Friday the 13th. And then this one came on and I was like, it's definitely a curveball compared to a lot of the horror that we're kind of used to. So Megan, let's start with you. Since this was a first time watch for you, recommendation, what did you think of Suspiria?
After I saw it, I found a different way to look at it, which changed it. So I'll come back to that. But for my first time through, the only thing I was told is you'll notice the color. So not knowing that paint colored blood, the very not gore, where it's more poetic than gruesome, was the first thing that stood out to me. Like, I thought that was a really interesting way to do it, because it wasn't like you're supposed to be like, oh, this is a slasher movie. This is all of this. It was really, this is art. This is supposed to be beautiful and deadly. And then into the color red through all the light. Like at first I was like, okay, I'm just supposed to assume there's something evil. So then when it started switching over to be more green, and then the witch's plot line comes in and stuff. And so then it really started being more signifying instead of it just being terrible things are happening with the red, with the here's evil, here's murder, all of this. It went to here's supernatural, here's witchcraft, here's this. And so it was cool to watch that switch. I also had no idea what was going on. I didn't realize that it was traditional for Italian movies to be dubbed fully after. So like at first I thought it was something where it was just a little off, but then reading about that after the fact, I was like, oh, okay. And how that sort of gives it that almost unsettled, but you don't quite know why, because it's not that the words are off, but they're not quite there either. Kind of felt a little removed. So I thought that was cool and really confusing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm going to break any new ground, but obviously the color palette had me very much engaged. And I was trying to decide, I'm like, okay, so is the color enhancing this movie, or is it kind of keeping me engaged in spite of the movie? And and then that's not to say that I wasn't interested, because having not seen it, I was like, all right, well, let me see where this all goes, because it's, you know, like you're saying, Megan, there's a lot going on and you're trying to sort it out. I think thankfully for my first time watch, really knew very little about the plot. I remember the line of Susie, what do you know about witches? So when that kind of hit, I'm like, okay, that's ringing a bell, because, you know, in my travels through moviedom, that's come up. So I'm like, yeah, all right. And I kind of eat into the fact that, yeah, this is probably a coven and they're doing some stuff here. But why? And what does it all mean? And I don't think we really get those answers. But yeah, I think the dreamlike sequences that are happening there, like the use of light and shadow, specifically like the one scene where after like the maggots infest the dorms and they have to all sleep in the gymnasium, like, are we going to turn the lights out now? The lights go out. It's red, but then you've got like the silhouette of people behind the curtain. Really cool camera choices and shots. I did like that you're really kind of thrust into it right from the get-go. Like the movie opens up, Susie's getting off the plane.
Yes.
She's in Munich, and like she's just walking out of the terminal, and you're already getting like the music. You're getting the cues of like the slow push on the door. And so like I'm already like disoriented. I'm like, all right, well, they're really just going right into something here, and I don't know what's happening. So I give Argento credit for like really just kind of grabbing you and being like, okay, come on. I don't know if it's all the sum of its parts in the end. I think having just watched it, I think I need to sit with it for a little bit longer. But yeah, interesting. Yeah, something I'm going to have to think about, you know, a little bit more.
That airport scene you mentioned, I think that does kind of feed into a little bit into the thing that both of you guys are talking about, that kind of otherworldliness about this movie. You've got, like you said, Pete, the music is kicking in. It's very strange, bizarre music that doesn't feel like your typical score. So it's already a bit disorienting. You're in Europe, like you mentioned, you're in Germany. And as she's walking, there's like these quick cuts to the door. And then when Susie steps out, she's literally hit by the weather, by like the storm. Then it starts getting really weird. I think that's kind of like the visual representation of what the movie feels like, where it is nightmarish, it's unsettling, it's a little off kilter. The music, the color, the compositions, it's not meant to make you feel like this is a traditional Hollywood horror production. It doesn't look like The Exorcist. It doesn't feel like Halloween. It's a little ambiguous, and it doesn't necessarily sound like those movies either. And that scene, I think, is Argento kind of like, outside of the airport, you're in my world. Inside of the airport, there's still a little bit of reality. There's still the terminal, but once you get out here, like, I get to paint the palette, you know, the canvas how I want. You're going to see my palette, and it's going to be a little weird and a little different.
So just really quick, I wanted to comment on the music too, because that was the other thing that, while knowing nothing about what was going on, the music and the discord amongst all of it is what builds up that sense of, I don't know if I'm in danger. Are you in danger? Is everything fine? Because that created this chaos when you're like, I don't know what's happening, but I know it's not going to be good. I know that something is happening, and it left you so confused. in a way that I think the movie probably wanted. Afterwards, I heard it described as an adult version of a fairy tale.
Yes.
That it literally opens on a dark and stormy night.
Yes.
And that you have a very innocent heroine, and there's witches and a dark forest and evil, and that it all takes place in innocuous places. It's a ballet school, that you're just in this town that really there's no other indication that there's anything that should be wrong, that it's just these places that you should be fine, that should be nice and normal and should not be harboring something evil. You're at school. You're essentially at a boarding school, and it's not supposed to be that place that's dangerous and has underlying things. So I thought that was kind of cool to go back and look at it that way, because then it became okay, you have a character who's literally being told, oh no, you're just having a mental breakdown. It's some sort of stress. It's something, not we're actively corrupting you with blood and doing all these other things to poison you, but we're also going to tell you, no, this is just you. This is all just in your head. This isn't really happening. None of these things are here. So it was cool to think of it that way, because then it kind of made that floaty fantasy sort of madness kind of make sense too.
Mm-hmm.
And didn't I believe I read, didn't Argento tell his cinematographer to like watch Snow White and Seven Dwarfs, and like that's the color palette I want?
Yes.
Yep. The Technicolor process that they used was the same that they used for Wizard of Oz and for Gone with the Wind. So that's why you get like those really vivid, rich colors. This was one of the last movies that was done like in this specific Technicolor process. And yeah, like Snow White is like a big reference point for Argento.
Well, it's always interesting to me, because something that's held up by so many people as like even a cult classic. I don't know if it's considered a classic. I've seen enough horror movies to know like Argento's name is mentioned. So I'm like, okay, so I'm also watching it with like an eye on like, what are other people seeing in this that they're like so into?
Yes.
I'm like, yeah, there's interesting stuff there. But again, I was like, is it the sum of its parts? I don't know. I don't think I'm going to have an answer to that for a little while. I'm going to have to think about it.
And that's where it's hard too for me, for a lot of things, especially things that are really nostalgic, where if it doesn't hold up now and I go back and watch it, if I didn't watch it to have that nostalgic tie or connection to something else that is its equivalent, where I'm like, I just don't appreciate it the way I think you appreciate it, and I would love to. But to me, I'm like, oh, this fell short of what it was hyped to be, and I don't know if that's because it was hyped, or if this was really something that was fantastic for its time. It was fantastic for your childhood, for all these different things where it resonated with a group of people. And you're like, I'm never going to match that level of viewership. I'm never going to have been that age in that setting when this was the cutting edge of everything to say I appreciate it. So that's one where I'm like, I can look at a lot of it. I can say that a lot of it is really beautiful in that, like when she was hanging and the blood that was running down her legs is straight lines. It's not all coagulated. I was like, that takes effort. But then there are enough times when I'm like, I don't know if I'm supposed to be getting more from these scenes. If there's supposed to be something that's really just supposed to be like, oh, that was brilliant. That was fantastic. That's this perfect tie-in. This is an amazing nod to something. I'm like, I feel like an uncultured swine. I don't know what you want from me.
Well, and I thought like the build up to it, I guess for some reason I was predisposed to thinking like the ending was going to be a downer, and that she was either going to turn out like Susie was going to either get brought into the coven or turn out to be a witch or something like that.
I thought the same.
So I'm like, okay, I was waiting for that. And when it didn't happen, I'm like, oh, okay. I'm like, well, that's interesting. But then it just kind of relegated the ending to stuff happens. She figured out through like the thunderstorm to see where like the head witch was to stab and kill her. And then the ballet school kind of blows up at the end. But I was like, I think I was expecting there to be a bit more of a payoff than be like, and I've figured it out and I'm going to kill you. And because I've killed you, kind of like with the vampire thing, your acolytes are going to die and I'm just going to walk out and happy ending. And that's fine. But I think I was because of like what we've talked about, because it's what I believe its resonance with people is, I was expecting something else. And I have to be okay with that. Cause like, to your point, if I'd seen it when I was younger, I'm sure that I would have a much different, feel for it than now. And I was just talking to my friend Graham about this because he was talking about wanting his son to watch the Monster Squad with him. And I know that so many people absolutely love the Monster Squad. Like it's like one of their favorite films. I didn't watch it when I was younger, so I watched it when I was older, and I'm like, okay, I get that this resonates with a lot of people. I'm like, but it doesn't really with me, and so I have no affinity for it.
Yeah,
and I think this is kind of like a similar situation because just watching it.
Absolutely. Where there's things where I can take away, and I'm sure there will be reference to it that I will catch in other things. Like you said, what do you know about witches? So I'm sure there are things where it's going to be like, I know what that's referencing. I know where that's coming into this. This is something that I now know that I have more to do, but where it's kind of like, okay, but now it becomes a pop culture reference, cult knowledgeable thing I have versus saying, I felt so impacted by this. I felt so different. So it was one of those where I think I got what I was supposed to. I think I probably gave it more than I would have if it had been talked up anymore. But I do agree when at the end I was just like, oh, well, maybe she's a more powerful witch kind of thing when you're like, okay. But
well, I don't know if you feel this way, but I've like what I appreciate, at least having seen it, is now I feel like it's almost kind of like I've added to my film knowledge now. So when someone else references this movie, I now have that reference point and I could be like, yes, okay, I know what you're talking about. Because before now, like when we've had like our friend Nick on and he's talking about these movies, I'm like, I kind of know, like I know in a very ethereal sense what he's talking about, but I don't know because I haven't seen any of these films. So now I feel like I can at least come at it from a place of some knowledge now. So I feel good about that. Kind of talking about the ending where like, I think we were both expecting Susie to either be brought into the coven or to be the more powerful witch. And it turns out, no, none of those things. She just kind of figures out what's going on, kills the head witch, and off into the rain for a happy ending for her.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. Wasn't expecting that.
I suppose if it's from the fairy tale approach, then that kind of is the thing where you killed the evil and it's over, where there's not anything beyond. It's that happily ever after where you're like, okay, that wasn't set up to be, here's more. Here's your character progression. Here's what you took away. It's no, you did the task. You got rid of the evil. Story's over.
And that's a great point. I think that tracks with, the whole fairy tale aspect of it. So that makes complete sense that, it would end the way that it did. I wasn't thinking about that at the time. I think I was bringing to bear, like having seen enough movies like that to be like, okay, late 70s, I'm guessing we're getting the downer ending, or like at the very least the mildly ambiguous one of like, but which survives or something else.
Yes.
And to not get that, I was like, oh, interesting.
I did like, after looking back, that with that peacock is that a nod to the bird with the crystal plumage? Because it's a crystal peacock that she ends up using its feathers to kill a witch. Was that intended to be a nod or just purely the prop of choice?
I'm going to guess because Argento, like he has like, I think it's called like the Mothers trilogy. And you have like some of the movies that are, I'm going to guess it's probably loosely connected in those ways where having not seen the others in a very long time, there's connective tissue. I think no dissimilar than he helped on the script for Dawn of the Dead, the George Romero from 1978 version. And you could say like all the Night of the Living Deads are kind of in the same universe. They're kind of loosely connected, but they're all kind of playing with the same idea of zombies and human nature, I think, in the same ways where he's like, well, here's some iconography from other movies I've done. They're not necessarily purposely being used, but he's still playing with the same themes. And I think kind of like to what you guys have been talking about, I think that's what my takeaway was after watching it the third or fourth time, where I'm like, yeah, this movie is honestly less about the plot and more about how it makes you feel. Okay, and then the whole place just burns down. That's how you guys are going to end it. Invisible witch made visible by lightning. Okay, like that works. Thank you. Like that's perfectly fine. That's a rational ending as anything else we may get considering how the rest of the movie was. But I think that's also similar to thinking about Romero and like Night of the Living Dead, that compared to, if you guys have ever seen Lucio Fulci's The Beyond, it's another zombie movie that's in the same breath as Night of the Living Dead, certainly inspired by Night of the Living Dead, but with The Beyond, you get this very ethereal quality that I think is very synonymous with a lot of these Italian directors like Bava, Argento, and Fulci. It's less tethered to like the narrative structure. There's not necessarily like a plot point 1, 2, and 3 in the end. she may or may not become a witch or become the new head of the dance school, or she could just as easily be killed, because it's almost less about that. There's an acceptance of like ambiguity of, we don't need to wrap this up in a bowl in the beyond. At the very end, it's like, hey, we opened the gates of hell and the apocalypse happened. Wait, what? I thought this was just about a woman inheriting a house in like Louisiana. It's like, no, it was about the apocalypse the whole time, but that wasn't important. It's like, oh, okay. And I think in the same ways with this, where even after a long exposition scene with Udo Kerr, that's like, all right, let's now talk about witches. And also let's bring in a professor to talk about witches and the occult. And let's connect it to mental illness because, we have to rationalize the occult and black magic, but it's really about witches. And then at the end, you're like, I think it was about witches. But I think that's the point. It's like, it wasn't really what anything was about. It was about maggots falling from the ceiling and that feeling icky. A woman falling into a pit of barbed wire, and how that scene
surprised me. I was not expecting that.
But she just willingly jumped in there too.
Yes.
But with the camera, like you don't see it. And so it's just like that quick drop. And I'm like, wow. I'm like, okay.
Yes. That's Susie, who also is credited as a co-writer, Daria Nicolidi. She co-wrote the film with Argento, but then to later have her come up as like a possessed zombie with like a knife or something in her hand that's going after Susie. It's not explained. It's like, oh, is Susie dead? Because she looks like she was dead and maybe crucified, because there seem to be nails in her hands.
Like nails in her eyes and her arms and feet. Yep.
Yeah.
And that's where I think, again, it's about the iconography, messing with the idea of religion, messing with the viewer to be like, hey, like she was dead. But, maybe the witches, if they're capable of possessing a dog, a seeing eye dog to bite its owner, then maybe they could bring a dead woman who's been killed by falling into the barbed wire pit back to life, and they'll act through her. That's where this movie, like, it kind of lives in that weird world where you could definitely tell someone like Guillermo del Toro was probably influenced by movies like this in making like Pan's Labyrinth, but then he was equally influenced by someone like Steven Spielberg, where he's like, but I still need a story. Like, I need a structure. It can't all just be hyper composition and color palettes, prog rock that sounds really bizarre. Like, it can't be about, it has to be also like, I have to have some structure. So when I see things like Crimson Peak, you could totally see the Suspiria in that. And I'm kind of glad, since you mentioned Pete, like you had not seen it, now that you see those 100 most impactful best horror film type list, Suspiria is always seemingly on it. Now it's like, oh, now I get the reference. Like, now I understand. And then in your case, Megan, how this is a movie that you got as a recommendation, that it's very off center to The Thing or Pumpkinhead, that are very much like in the main aisle of horror recommendations. It's like, oh, watch Suspiria. It's like, ooh, like that's Adult Swim time. Like this is okay. This is going to be a little weird. It's not going to feel like a normal Hollywood film, but I'm glad that, that you kind of processing it.
Oh, yeah. No, it is definitely, it's interesting because like you said, for the movies that are set up the way that you were describing, where it's ultimately doesn't matter, it's all these different things and the different takeaways, those are great to me in hindsight, but so frustrating to watch because I'm like, is this one of them? Or am I just not understanding what I'm supposed to understand?
Yep.
Where it's just be like, tell me up front if this is one of those, hey, this is always going to be above your head. And it should be. It should never always make sense to you because it's not supposed to. But then it's where I want to be like, am I dumb? It's so fascinating.
Something you said earlier too about like the language thing, because that's really jarring.
Yes.
But that was kind of like the Tower of Babel approach that a lot of the more non-Hollywood film production is done, where you're not thinking necessarily with, you don't have a lot of resources. You're not thinking in a streamlined way like you might in a typical Hollywood production, where you're like, no, we're going to get a bunch of actors and they're the best people that are available. And it's Europe. So someone from France is an hour or 2 hours away. So you could have Udo Kerr in this movie, a young Udo Kerr, who's probably speaking German to an Italian actor who's maybe the professor. And the idea is that all these actors are basically being told, you're reacting to this person's line and you may not understand that language, but react accordingly. That feels weird. Like it feels off, like everything else that you've watched up to this point. But I think that just kind of adds to to the idea that like, yep, this isn't a Hollywood production. It's not made like a Hollywood production. So it's offbeat.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like that concept too of like, if it's a movie, I'm just going to overgeneralize. If it's a movie marketed for Americans, if you put something in another language where you're like, if you just knew this language, what was being said, what was written here, you'd know everything. But it's the point that you don't know that. And you're just one level removed from understanding because you don't know X. If you knew how to speak this language, here's the answer to everything. It's written literally on the walls while she's walking past. It probably says everything. But you're like, but you don't know it. And we're banking on you not know it. We're banking on a small percentage of the target audience of this not knowing this language, this symbol, this anything, this Norse mythology reference for you to have unraveled the plot. But we want you to know you were one step away from knowing the entire time. And that's all that stopped. So like, sometimes I like that too. I'm like, oh, if I knew what that wall said, if I only could read what was written there, that probably would be helpful.
In that case, you're Susie the American, right?
Yeah.
Arriving at a boarding school, thinking that this is what your experience is going to be. You're going to learn new things, meet new people, have a good experience in another country, just to then be confronted by witches.
Or even before that, for the taxi driver to repeat back the same thing she had said, when you're like, oh, it's not even just that you were saying it right or wrong. It's that somebody is choosing to say, oh, you're doing it slightly off. Yes. I'm not going to humor you. I'm going to create this disconnect and this barrier between us because you're clearly an American that came here and you're saying it slightly wrong. He probably knew the whole time what she was saying, and by him saying it back almost the exact same way, we're like, oh, okay, you've already put yourself in this very alienated sort of feeling by saying no one is immediately on your side. You're denied entry to the school that you're supposed to be at. You are put into this house with somebody who immediately, whether by their own choice or through witchcraft, kicked you out. And now you're here. And now you're not allowed to eat on your own terms. So it's that you don't get to make a choice under the guise of you're totally doing this on your own free will.
There's that interesting brief moment where she's not like the headmistress that's running the school, but she's basically running like the classes, like the German woman. When she remarks to Susie, she's like, oh, I forget exactly. I'm going to paraphrase, like, oh, you're very strong-willed or something like that.
Yes.
Yep.
And she's like, yeah, I guess I am. And so there's like that. I think that plays into like now they're like doubly trying to like remove her agency because like, oh, we think you're going to fight us on this. Well, we're just going to completely mess with your life. And I think that really echoes what the points that you were just making, because they had like that one small scene where they're kind of surprised that she's sticking up for herself the way that she is. Yeah,
she pushes back against the plan and she's like, no, this is what I'd rather do. And they're like, oh,
right, that's right. Yeah.
You've made up your mind and you stuck with it. And they're like, because isn't it then the very next scene where she starts feeling weak?
Yep.
And then they basically kind of put her on house arrest in a way, and all those things that they do to like logistically set her up, where she's like, oh no, I kind of enjoyed staying off campus.
Yes.
Well, that's not available to you anymore. And now you're not feeling well. So we have to take care of you. And we have to have our slightly, interesting character of like a butler servant guy come around who, certainly is like visually kind of like scary, but always kind of there as like a red herring because the dance school teacher, she comes across as, just like the German instructor, like they're rigid, but they seem to be normal. It's just all of these other things that are happening around the school. What is it? Sarah, the friend, it's like, is she paranoid? Is she the one that could be mentally ill? And Susie is just kind of like being thrown into her ordeal because everything else seems okay. But if not, it's probably the weird guy who they just said, can't speak anymore because of some sort of dental type issue. Like it's all just kind of thrown out there in a way that you're just like, yep, none of this really matters. Like, is this making you feel weird? Yep, good. Mission accomplished.
Yeah.
Yep.
Now, did you enjoy it, Megan, considering that, again, it was a referral?
I liked it more once I could view it from a fairy tale aspect, because that was a way for my brain to say, okay, this makes sense it's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be, if you're going to say witchcraft in there, when you're going to be like, it's not going to be based on fact and experience and all these other things. So I liked looking back at it that way. Definitely afterwards, I'm like, well, it's definitely an experience, but I don't know what I was supposed to have gotten. So then looking back at it that way with the fairy tale idea, and then I was like, okay, I could see this. I can see the kind of unnerving, the beautiful images tied into things. Her running through the perfectly straight trees at night, where you're like, if this was a still image, this is a really striking image. If I was watching with somebody that I'm going to say that got it, where they're like, okay, this scene in particular, this is what they're trying to do here. And I could be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I can see those. I can put those things together. But it's one that I don't know that it resonated enough with me, either through feeling like it was over my head, not having the nostalgic tie, not understanding. So I don't know if it's one that I would say, yeah, I would absolutely sit down and watch it from start to finish again. Or if it's one that if somebody were like, hey, here's a breakdown of this movie, I'd probably watch that. I'd probably watch something where they're like, hey, this was my opinion. This is things I noticed. I think that'd be fascinating. But sit and watch the whole movie again, I don't know that I'd be in a hurry to do so.
How about you, Pete? Since, again, this has come up in a lot of conversations, a lot of top 100 type lists. Now that you have it checked off your list, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree a lot with what Megan just said. I was completely engaged watching it, on board to see where the twists and turns went. You know, it's got that very dreamlike element to it. So I understood early on, like, this probably isn't following your typical 3-act structure. And I could say that it was interesting. Again, I'm not sure how soon I would revisit it. It's not a criticism. Yeah, I think I need some time removed from it to think about it a little bit more, to kind of figure out like what my feelings ultimately are about it. And I think a lot of it comes back to the ending. And I get what you said as to how, like, the stuff that's happening isn't really the point. It's kind of like the visuals. It's the discordant music. It's the evoking a feeling. But I think because you've got all of that for most of the runtime, and then for the ending to kind of just do almost in some ways like a traditional just like wrap up of, she finally figures out what's going on in the final 5 minutes. She figures out how to stop the witches, exits, and then we've got credits. You've been watching Suspiria come up.
Yes.
And so it's interesting to me, because I'm like, there's a discordance in my viewing experience of what I had seen for an hour and 25 minutes, and then that final 5 minutes almost like reverting back to a quote unquote standard movie ending. But everything that came before that was all like fantastical and visually engaging and all these things. And so I got to wrap my head around it a little bit more, I think.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. I think it's also maybe, again, going back to like zombies, where if you saw the Zack Snyder 2004 Dawn of the Dead movie, and that was like your first experience with zombies, and then you went back to see the 1968 Romero Night of the Living Dead, even though one certainly was the inspiration, like you couldn't have Dawn of the Dead, the remake, without the original, let alone without Night of the Living Dead. But to have that progression, I would totally understand if someone said, I don't want to watch those other movies. Those other movies have a different pace. They feel like they're different. Like, yeah, they're products of their time. I think that's where I've always kind of taken from Suspiria that it almost feels like you were saying early on, Megan, it feels like you're watching a piece of art. This certainly has informed a lot of filmmakers since 1977. And I think that's where, like, it's kind of neat now that you guys have seen this. I'm hoping that as you guys, have seen maybe more horror movies, now you can kind of be like, oh, I can see now how that's connected to Suspiria.
Yeah.
Even if Suspiria doesn't leave the long-lasting impression, you're like, I get it now. I see the DNA behind this. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's almost like a poem versus a story. Whereas like a story is going to lay it all out for you. You're going to get all the details, where a poem where it'd be like, I might not know what you're referencing. It might be ambiguous so that I can take my own experience and put it in here, where you're like, this isn't cut and dry. I want you to say, this gives you this feeling. This ties this memory to this. Okay, apply it here. Where every viewer is not going to watch it the same way, take the same thing. So like, it's kind of, because I was thinking about how you had said that I said, which sounds really redundant, that it was poetic and it was because it was artistic. But then you saying it now, that's the first thing that popped in my head. It's like, oh yeah, it's like a poem where everybody can walk away and be like, oh no, it means this. Where you're like, there's parts where you're like, no, this is absolutely cut and dry. This is what I was supposed to get from this line. It's hard because I like that. Here's the story. I definitely have a hard time. I'm like, no, just tell me what you wanted me to know. I want to know it, kind of thing.
Big question is, have either of you already changed your ringtone to the Goblin music? That's really what we need to know.
So I'm curious that they're referenced in the credits as the goblins, but it's the same goblin that he had Romero use for Dawn of the Dead soundtrack.
That's right. And Argento composed the music for Dawn of the Dead, brought in those longtime collaborators from those films. So, yep, it's Goblin. That's right. You can almost see the van with the airbrush of their name already in your head. You already know what that looks like. And, yep, that's exactly what it looks like.
And I can hear it, too.
Yes, 100%. Absolutely. Yes.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Before we go, Bernie, you know how I like to make, this may not be all that esoteric, a connection between like different films. I did it.
The dots that you connect, but yes.
Yes. I connected some dots in this one too. Maybe a little more linear than that other one that I did. But Susie, played by American actress Jessica Harper, and again, like a face that I recognize. I'm like, where do I know her from? But then as the movie's going on, you know, the blind music teacher, Daniel, when he shows up on the scene, I'm like, this guy looks like a reject from Rocky Horror Picture Show. And so here's where the connection comes in. And so Jessica Harper was in Shock Treatment, which was the pseudo sequel to Rocky Horror Picture Show. And she plays Janet Weiss in that. That also stars, you know, Richard O'Brien, Nell Campbell, Patricia Quinn, all back from the original. No Tim Curry in that one. And I don't think I've ever seen Shock Treatment all the way through. I've seen a couple of the musical numbers in it, but then I'm like, I've just connected some dots here because you got Daniel, looks like he could have been, you know, doing the time warp.
Absolutely.
Again.
Now Jessica Harper, who was again, and then Jessica Harper, who is in this, basically the pseudo sequel to Rocky Horror. Like, and there we go. There's our connection.
That's fantastic.
Kismet.
So one thing we know about Pete Megan, if you have a trivia night near you, call him up.
Okay, I love trivia. I'm on board.
There we go.
It just has to be like really obscure topics.
Yes.
You're a bonus point guy.